The King's Speech. How One Man Saved the British Monarchy. By Mark Logue and Peter Conradi. Narrated by Simon Vance. Copyright 2010 by Mark Logue and Peter Conradi. This unabridged audiobook is published by arrangement with Sterling Publishing Company, Incorporated, and was produced in the year 2011 by Tantor Media, Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto.
In this grave hour, perhaps the most fateful in our history, I send to every household of my people, both at home and overseas, this message, spoken with the same depth of feeling for each one of you as if I were able to cross your threshold and speak to you myself. For the second time in the lives of most of us, we are at war. Over and over again, we have tried to find a peaceful way out of the differences between ourselves and those who are now our enemies. But it has been in vain. We have been forced into a conflict, for we are called with our allies to meet the challenge of a principle which, if it were to prevail, would be fatal to any civilized order in the world. It is the principle which permits a state in the selfish pursuit of power to disregard its treaties and its solemn pledges, which sanctions the use of force or threat of force against the sovereignty and independence of other states. Such a principle, stripped of all disguise, is surely the mere primitive doctrine that might is right. And if this principle were established throughout the world, the freedom of our own country and of the whole British Commonwealth of nations would be in danger. But far more than this, the peoples of the world would be kept in the bondage of fear, and all hopes of settled peace and of the security of justice and liberty among nations would be ended. This is the ultimate issue which confronts us. For the sake of all that we ourselves hold dear, and of the world's order and peace, it is unthinkable that we should refuse to meet the challenge. It is to this high purpose that I now call my people at home and my peoples across the seas, who will make our cause their own. I ask them to stand calm and firm and united in this time of trial. The task will be hard. There may be dark days ahead, and war can no longer be confined to the battlefield. But we can only do the right as we see the right, and reverently commit our cause to God. If one and all we keep resolutely faithful to it, ready for whatever service or sacrifice it may demand, then, with God's help, we shall prevail. May he bless and keep us all.
Introduction. When I was growing up in the 1970s and 1980s, we lived in Belgium, where my father Anthony worked as a lawyer at the European headquarters of Procter & Gamble. Over the years we moved between various houses on the outskirts of Brussels, but there was one constant. Regardless of where we were, a collection of photographs and mementos would be set up on a mantelpiece or windowsill. Among them was a photograph of my father in his Scots Guards uniform, another of him and my mother, Elizabeth, on the wedding day in 1953, and a picture of my Australian-born paternal grandfather, Lionel, and his wife Myrtle. Also, more intriguingly, there was a leather-framed portrait of King George VI, the father of the present Queen, signed and dated the 12th of May 1937, the day of his coronation. Another picture of him and his wife, Elizabeth, better known to my generation as the Queen Mother, and their two daughters, the future Queen Elizabeth, then a girl of 11, and her little sister Margaret Rose. And a third of the royal couple dated 1928, when they were still the Duke and Duchess of York, signed Elizabeth and Albert. The significance of all these photographs must have been explained to me, but as a young boy I never paid too much attention. I understood the link with royalty was through Lionel, but he was ancient history to me. He had died in 1953, 12 years before I was born. The sum of my knowledge about my grandfather was that he had been the King's speech therapist, whatever that was, and I left it at that. I never asked any more questions, and no more detailed information was volunteered. I was far more interested in the various medals and buttons laid out alongside the photographs. I used particularly to enjoy dressing up in my father's officer's belt and hat, and playing at soldiers with the medals pinned proudly on my shirt. But as I grew older and had children of my own, I began to wonder about who my ancestors were and where they had come from. The growing general interest in genealogy further piqued my curiosity. Looking back through the family tree, I came across a great-grandmother from Melbourne who had 14 children, only 7 of whom survived beyond infancy. I also learnt that my great-great-grandfather left Ireland for Australia in 1850 aboard the SS Boyne. As far as I was concerned, my grandfather was only one among many members of an extended family divided between Australia, Ireland, and Britain. That remained the case even after the death of my father in 2001, when I was left the task of going through the personal papers he had kept in a tall grey filing cabinet. There, among the wills, deeds, and other important documents, were hundreds of old letters and photographs collected by my grandfather, all neatly filed away in chronological order in a document wallet. It was only in June 2009, when I was approached by Ian Canning, who was producing a film, The King's Speech, about Lionel, that I began to understand the significance of the role played by my grandfather, about how he had helped the then Duke of York, who reluctantly became king in December 1936 after the abdication of his elder brother Edward VIII, in his lifelong battle against a chronic stammer that turned every public speech or radio broadcast into a terrifying ordeal. I began to appreciate that his life and work could be of interest to a far wider audience beyond my own family. That April, Lionel had been the subject of the afternoon play on BBC Radio 4, again called A King's Speech by Mark Burgess. This film was to be something far bigger, however, a major motion picture with a big-name cast that included Helena Bonham Carter, Colin Firth, Geoffrey Rush, Michael Gambon, and Derek Jacobi. It is directed by Tom Hooper, the man behind the acclaimed The Damned United, which showed a very different side of recent English history, the football manager Brian Clough's short and stormy tenure as manager of Leeds United in 1974. Canning and Hooper, of course, wanted their film to be as historically accurate as possible, so I set out to try and discover as much as I could about my grandfather. The obvious starting point was my father's filing cabinet. Examining Lionel's papers properly for the first time, I found vividly written diaries in which he had recorded his meetings with the king in extraordinary detail. There was copious correspondence, often warm and friendly, with George VI himself, and various other records, including a little appointment card covered in my grandfather's spider-like handwriting in which he described his first encounter with the future king in his small consulting room in Harley Street on the 19th of October, 1926. Taken together with other fragments of information I managed to gather online, and the few pages of references to Lionel included in most biographies of George VI, this allowed me to learn more about my grandfather's unique relationship with the king, and also to correct some of the part-truths and overstretched memories that had become blurred across the generations. It soon became clear, however, that the archive was incomplete. Missing were a number of letters and diary entries from the 1920s and 1930s, snippets of which had been quoted in John Wheeler Bennett's authorised biography of George VI, published in 1958. Also nowhere to be found were the scrapbooks of newspaper cuttings that, as I knew from my cousins, Lionel had collected for much of his adult life. Perhaps the most disappointing absence, though, was that of a letter written by the king in December 1944, which had particularly captured my imagination. Its existence was revealed in a passage in Lionel's diary in which he described a conversation between the two men after the monarch had delivered his annual Christmas message to the nation for the first time without my grandfather at his side. "My job is over, sir," Lionel told him. "Not at all," the king replied. "It is the preliminary work that counts, and that is where you are indispensable." Then, according to Lionel's account, he thanked me, and 2 days later wrote me a very beautiful letter which I hope will be treasured by my descendants. Had I had the letter, I would have treasured it, but it was nowhere to be found amid the mass of correspondence, newspaper cuttings, and diary entries. This missing letter inspired me to leave no stone unturned, to exhaust every line of inquiry in what became a quest to piece together as many details as I could of my grandfather's life. I pestered relatives, returning to speak to them time and again. I wrote to Buckingham Palace, to the Royal Archives at Windsor Castle, and to the authors and publishers of books about George VI, in the hope that the letter may have been among material they had borrowed from my father or his 2 elder brothers, and had failed to return. But there was no trace of it. Towards the end of 2009, I was invited onto the set of The King's Speech during filming in Portland Place in London. During a break I met Geoffrey Rush, who plays my grandfather, and Ben Wimsett, who portrays my father aged 10. After getting over the initial strangeness of seeing someone as a child I'd only ever known as a man, I became fascinated by a scene in which Rush's character hovers over my father and his elder brother Valentine, played by Dominic Applewhite, while they're made to recite Shakespeare. It reminded me of a similar real-life scene when I was a boy and my father obliged me to do the same. My father had a passion and a gift for poetry and verse, often repeating verbatim entire passages that he remembered since childhood. He used to revel in his ability to rattle off reams of Hilaire Belloc as a party piece to guests. But it was from my elder sister Sarah that he derived the most satisfaction. Indeed, she was often moved to tears by his recitals. At the time, I don't remember being much impressed by my father's talent. Looking back on the scene as an adult, however, I could appreciate both his perseverance and the acute frustration he must have felt at my reluctance to share the love of poetry that his father had instilled in him. Filming ended in January 2010, and this also marked the beginning of a more personal voyage of discovery for me. Canning and Hooper did not set out to make a documentary, but rather a biopic, which, although true to the spirit of my grandfather, concentrates on a narrow period of time from the first meeting between my grandfather and the future king in 1926 until the outbreak of war in 1939. Inspired by the film, I wanted to tell the complete story of my grandfather's life, from his childhood in Adelaide, South Australia in the 1880s, right the way through to his death. Thus I started extensive and detailed research into his character and what he had done during his life. It was in many ways a frustrating process because, despite Lionel's professional status, very little was known about the methods he employed with the king. Although he wrote a few articles for the press about the treatment of stammering and other speech impediments, he never set out his methods in a formal way, and had no student or apprentice with whom to share the secrets of his work. Nor, probably because of the discretion with which he always treated his relationship with the king, did he write up his most famous case. Then, in July 2010, with the publishers pressing for the manuscript, my perseverance finally paid off. On hearing of my quest for material, my cousin Alex Marshall contacted me to say that she had found some boxes of documents relating to my grandfather. She didn't think they would be of much use, but even so, I invited myself up to her home in Rutland to take a look. I was greeted with several volumes arranged on a table in her dining room. There were 2 banker's boxes full of correspondence between the king and Lionel dating from 1926 to 1952. And 2 more boxes filled with manuscripts and press cuttings, which Lionel had carefully glued into 2 big scrapbooks, one green and the other blue. To my delight, Alex also had the missing parts of the archive, together with 3 volumes of letters and a section of diary that my grandmother, Myrtle, kept when she and my grandfather embarked on a trip round the world in 1910, and also during the first few months of the Second World War. Written in a more personal style than Lionel's diary, this gave a far more revealing insight into the minutiae of their life together. The documents, running to hundreds of pages, were a fascinating treasure trove that I spent days going through and deciphering. My only regret was that the letter that I had been so desperate to find was not among them. It is all this material that forms the basis for this book, which Peter Conradi, an author and journalist with the Sunday Times, has helped me to put together. I hope that in reading it you will come to share my fascination with my grandfather and his unique and very close relationship with King George VI. Although I have endeavoured to research my grandfather's life exhaustively, there may be pieces of information about him that still remain undiscovered. If you are related to Lionel Logue, were a patient or colleague of his, or if you have any other information about him and his work, I would love to hear from you. I can be contacted on lionellogue@gmail.com. Mark Logue, London, August 2010. Chapter 1. God Save the King. Albert, Frederick, Arthur, George, King of the United Kingdom and the British Dominions, and the last Emperor of India, woke up with a start. It was just after 3 a.m. The bedroom in Buckingham Palace he had occupied since becoming monarch 5 months earlier was normally a haven of peace and quiet in the heart of London, but on this particular morning his slumbers had been rudely interrupted by the crackle of loudspeakers being tested outside on Constitution Hill. "One of them might have been in our room," he wrote in his diary. And then, just when he thought he might finally be able to go back to sleep, the marching bands and troops started up. It was the 12th of May 1937, and the 41-year-old king was about to face one of the greatest and most nerve-wracking days of his life, his coronation. Traditionally, the ceremony is held 18 months after the monarch comes to the throne, leaving time not just for all the preparations, but also for a decent period of mourning for the previous king or queen. This coronation was different. The date had already been chosen to crown his elder brother, who had become king on the death of their father, King George V, in January 1936. Edward VIII had lasted less than a year on the throne, however, after succumbing to the charms of Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee, and it was his younger brother Albert, Duke of York, who reluctantly succeeded him when he abdicated that December. Albert took the name George VI, as both a tribute to his late father and a sign of continuity with his reign after the upheavals of the previous year that had plunged the British monarchy into one of the greatest crises in its history. At about the same time, in the considerably less grand setting of Sydenham Hill in the suburbs of south-east London, a handsome man in his late 50s with a shock of brown hair and bright blue eyes was also stirring. He, too, had a big day ahead of him. The Australian-born son of a publican, his name was Lionel Logue, and since his first meeting with the future monarch just over a decade earlier, he had occupied a curious but increasingly influential role at the heart of the royal family. Just to be on the safe side, Logue, who was a reluctant driver, had had a chauffeur sleep overnight at his house. With his statuesque wife Myrtle, who was to accompany him on that momentous day, he began to prepare himself for the journey into town. Myrtle, who was wearing £5,000 worth of jewellery, looked radiant. A meeting with a hairdresser whom they'd agreed to pick up along the way would add the final touch. Logue, in full court costume, was rather conscious of his silk-stockinged legs, and had to keep taking care not to trip over his sword. As the hours ticked by, and the streets of London began to fill with crowds of well-wishers, many of whom had slept out on camp beds, both men's sense of apprehension grew. The king had a sinking feeling inside, and could eat no breakfast. "I knew that I was to spend a most trying day, and to go through the most important ceremony of my life," he wrote in his diary that evening. "The hours of waiting before leaving for Westminster Abbey were the most nerve-wracking." With origins dating back almost a millennium, the coronation of a British monarch in Westminster Abbey is a piece of national pageantry unmatched anywhere in the world. At the centre of the ceremony is the anointing. While the monarch is seated in the medieval King Edward's chair, a canopy over his head, the Archbishop of Canterbury touches his hands, breast, and head with consecrated oil. A cocktail of orange, roses, cinnamon, musk, and ambergris, it is dispensed from a filigreed spoon filled from an eagle-shaped ampulla. By that act, the monarch is consecrated before God to the service of his peoples to whom he has sworn a grave oath. For a man as deeply religious as King George VI, it was difficult to overestimate the significance of this avowal of his dependence on the Almighty for the spirit, strength, and power needed to do right by his subjects. To be at the centre of such a ceremony, all the while balancing an ancient £7 crown on his head, would have been a huge ordeal for anyone, but the king had particular reason to view what was in store for him with trepidation. Plagued since childhood with a series of medical ailments, he also suffered from a debilitating stammer. Embarrassing enough in small gatherings, it turned public speaking into a major ordeal. The king, in the words of America's Time magazine, was the most famed contemporary stammerer in the world, joining a roll call of prominent names stretching back to antiquity that included Aesop, Aristotle, Demosthenes, Virgil, Erasmus, and Darwin. Worse, in the weeks running up to the coronation, the king had been forced to endure a whispering campaign about his health, stirred up by supporters of his embittered elder brother, who was now living in exile in France. The new king, it was rumoured, was in such a poor physical state that he would not be able to endure the coronation ceremony, let alone discharge his functions as sovereign. Further fuel for the campaign had been provided by the king's decision not to go ahead with an accession durbar in Delhi that his predecessor had agreed should take place during the cold weather season of 1937-38. The invited congregation had to be in the abbey by around 7 a.m. Crowds cheered them as they passed. A special tube train running from Kensington High Street to Westminster was laid on for members of the House of Commons and for peers and peeresses who travelled in full robes and wearing their coronets. Logue and his wife set off from their home at 6:40, travelling through deserted streets, northwards through Denmark Hill and Camberwell Green, and then westwards towards the newly rebuilt Chelsea Bridge, which had been opened less than a week earlier by William Lyon Mackenzie King, the Canadian Prime Minister who was in town for the coronation. One by one the police constables spotted the P in green lettering on the windscreen of their car and waved them through, until, just before the Tate Gallery, they ran into a jam of cars from all over London converging on the Abbey. They got out as they reached the covered way opposite the statue of Richard the Lionheart in Parliament Square, and had squeezed into their seats by 7:30. The King and Queen travelled to the Abbey in the gold state coach, a magnificent enclosed carriage drawn by 8 horses that had been first used by King George III to open Parliament in 1762. For the present king, the presence of his wife, Queen Elizabeth, was an enormous reassurance. During their 14 years of marriage, she had been a hugely calming influence on him. Whenever he faltered in the middle of a speech, she would squeeze his arm affectionately, willing him to go on, usually with success. Seated in the royal box were the king's mother, Queen Mary, and his 2 young daughters. The smaller one, Princess Margaret Rose, now aged 6 and naughty at the best of times, was bored and squirming. As the interminably long service continued, she stuck her finger in her eye, pulled her ears, swung her legs, rested her head on her elbow, and tickled her rather more serious elder sister Elizabeth, who had recently celebrated her 11th birthday. As was so often the case, the elder girl found herself urging her sister to be good. Queen Mary finally quietened Margaret Rose by giving her a pair of opera glasses to peek through. Reassurance of another kind was provided by Logue, whose presence in a box overlooking the ceremony was a sign of his importance to the king. A self-described common colonial, who, despite a career devoted to elocution, had never quite succeeded in shaking off his Australian accent, Logue seemed strangely out of place among the upper echelons of the British aristocracy, given pride of place in the Abbey. Yet it would be difficult to exaggerate the contribution to the day's momentous events that had been made by a man whom the newspapers called the king's speech doctor, or speech specialist. Such was Logue's status that he had just been made a member of the Royal Victorian Order, an appointment entirely in the gift of the sovereign. The award was front-page news. His was, declared the Daily Express, one of the most interesting of the names in the coronation honours list. Logue wore the medal proudly on his chest in the Abbey. In the 11 years since his arrival on the boat from Australia, Logue, from his rented room in Harley Street in the heart of the British medical establishment, had become one of the most prominent figures in the emerging field of speech therapy. For much of that time he had been helping the then Duke of York tackle his speech impediment. For the past month they had been preparing for the great day, rehearsing over and over again the time-honoured responses that the king would have to give in the Abbey. In the years they had worked together, whether at Logue's little surgery, at Sandringham, Windsor, or Buckingham Palace, they had developed a system. First, Logue would study the text, spotting any words that might trip the king up, such as those that began with a hard K or G sound, or perhaps with repeated consonants, and wherever possible replace them with something else. Logue would then mark up the text with suggested breathing points, and the king would start practising again and again until he got it right, often becoming extremely frustrated in the process. But there could be no tampering with the words of the coronation service. This was the real test, and it was about to begin. The various princes and princesses, both British and foreign, had started to be shown to their places at 10:15 a.m. Then came the king's mother, walking to the stately music of the official coronation march, followed by the various state representations, and then the Queen, her marvellous train carried by her 6 ladies-in-waiting. A fanfare of trumpets, and the king's procession was soon advancing, a blaze of gold and crimson, wrote Logue in his diary, in which he was to record much of his life in Britain. And at the end, the man whom I had served for 10 years, with all my heart and soul, comes, as he advances slowly towards us, looking rather pale, but every inch a king. My heart creeps up into my throat, as I realize that this man whom I serve is to be made King of England. As Cosmo Lang, the Archbishop of Canterbury, led the coronation service, Logue was listening probably more intently than anyone else present in the Abbey, even though the toothache from which he was suffering kept threatening to distract him. The king seemed nervous to him at the beginning, and Logue's heart missed a beat when he started the oath, but on the whole he spoke well. When it was all over, Logue was jubilant. "The king spoke with a beautiful inflection," he told a journalist. In fact, given the pressure the king was under, it was a wonder he had spoken his words so clearly. While holding the book with a form of service for him to read, the Archbishop had inadvertently covered the words of the oath with his thumb. Nor was that the only mishap. When the Lord Great Chamberlain started to dress the king in his robes, his hands were shaking so much he nearly put the hilt of the sword under the king's chin, rather than attaching it to the belt where it should have been. And then, as the king sat up from the coronation chair, a bishop trod on his robe, almost causing him to fall over until the king ordered him pretty sharply to get off it. Such hitches were an inevitable.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?